Hello, everyone. Uh, Welcome to the first session of the IGDC today. Uh, I'll be talking about is an idea all that it takes to ship mass market games. It's my first IGDC. Excited to be here, and my first year at Zynga as well. Uh, so quickly, is this talk for you? Right. So if you're a student, a game design enthusiast, working for a gaming company, you have a live op setup that's looking to test new concepts. You're looking to build new games. If you're curious how to get started with building a game, this session is for you. The caveat is that this session is intended to get you started on the game dev process and help you find a more probable path of success, but it's not a prescription on how to build a game. So the goal for this session is for us to explore like how can you build a viable mass market game, right? So we'll walk you through what we can in this limited time, and maybe we can have a conversation right towards the end if we have a few minutes left as well. The best example, I think, when we talk of mass market games in today's market is probably hyper casual. Hence, I picked hyper casual for this conversation. It also helps us break down how we can actually go about thinking about a game, right? And helps us test concepts and take it to market easily. For the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be walking you through how you should think of an idea, how you should test an idea, and how do you know if the idea is going to work, right? And like I said, hyper casual is a great place to start that conversation. So, what is a hyper casual game, right? So, it's free, it's easy to play, it's simple to understand, it's mass market, which means there are no age or dexterity restrictions. It's monetized with ads typically. However, we do see that there is a genre of hyper casual games that are moving to better retention as well as promoting in-app purchases, right? And there is this new category of hybrid casuals also that's picking up, which adds a new flavor to hyper casual games as well. So let's come to the biggest question that we've all had at some point in our careers, right? Like, how do you really discover a good game idea, right? We've all had game ideas that we thought could turn into a massive game, right? But is there a science to it? Is there an art to it? That's the real question. The first one I'd say is you really need to build skin in the game, right? What I mean by that is, like they say, the best writers are the ones who read a lot, right? They've learned how to build skin in the game, right? So games that are in your comfort zone, right? Games that you hate, games that bring you joy, games that make you squirm. Like you have to build a context around all of those games and everything that you've worked so far. My personal favorite are the arcade games of the 80s, right? And it's surprising to see how many of those base mechanics have really survived the test of time. And that's been a great place for me to start. But you can always look at what's around you. You can look at the games that your friends play, your family plays, what motivates them, what excites them, right? Like we say, study what people do and not what they say. uh, what I mean by that is read App Store reviews, right? Hang out in forums where players hang out. Try to understand from first principles what makes a game tick. Look at unbiased sources of data. Um, uh, Hold on, I'm just turning my video on. Sure. Look at unbiased sources of data, not company promoted research. App Store reviews are a good starting point. Build expertise by going into your country's App Store or Play Store. Look at top charts, like what's trending this week versus last week. Look at trends on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. It's a cumulative trend on what people are consuming, right? That's what trends do, and gives you a sense of what people are doing on a day-to-day basis and how this evolves over time. One of the things that I've been rather a student of, and it's been more fascinating for me over time, is to understand player motivations, right? Like what makes them play a certain game. Is it something in their environment? Is it something that is intrinsically available for them as motivation to look at? These are aspects I feel over time you get to get a sense of what what motivates people, right? What, how, why they do what they do, and that becomes a huge factor into thinking about what games you should build. I believe it's probably the single biggest learning area if somebody needs to build a new game. The last one is probably a great place to look as well, and I call them graveyards. App Store or Play Store graveyards, right? These are the places where a lot of successful games have come, seen success, and probably aren't around anymore, right? So the best hyper casual games, for instance, typically have a life of 6 to 12 months. Uh, if you go back in time, understand what worked for them in those games, right? It could be, I mean, it's important to distinguish if it was a point in time at which they were successful, or were there other things that worked for them, right? And you will see that over time, a lot of the really massively successful games have a lot of the base mechanics in common, right? Now, if you go back in time, even a year or so back, breaking it down and understanding what made that game work, like what were the core loops, what was the context in which it worked, what made it more fun, right? What made it more replayable, all of those are exciting aspects. And I think it gives a fascinating study of the point in time in which the audience was, right? There could be step curve germs, for instance, like in India, what a Play Store looked before and after Geo would be fundamentally different, right? So if there are macro events that trigger, that could also be an insight. And how did those macro events really motivate folks to change behavior, right? That's an exciting place to look and understand. Overall, I think this and the previous point kind of highlights how being a student of human behavior is super critical to be successful in this space. Um, the last and probably the most important thing I'd say is stay original, right? And what I mean by that is not necessarily always new. If you've read, Peter Thiel's Zero to One, or followed most companies that have gone on to build new markets, not necessarily in gaming, but many other spaces as well, they've done so because they've taken a fresh perspective to an existing market reality or a problem, right? Uh, they've not done so by copying chart toppers at that time, right? They've not, I think resisting that temptation to copy chart toppers is super critical. It's important to understand what has worked for an existing game. Like going back to the previous point, learn from them. What can you layer on top of it, right? What can you add on top of something that exists that makes gameplay fresh, that kind of touches an inherent or a latent need within a player that can make them actually jump up and try to play a game. I think that becomes the key. In the off chance that you actually find something new and totally inventive, that is absolutely amazing. But just given the odds of that happening in a market like today, where information is so easily available, is very hard, right? So I don't think you should push yourself to say I'm going to do something new that just doesn't exist, because that is a really hard one to do. Building something new that is liked by people and is relevant to people is a super hard problem. This is a probably more systematic way for you to get to a good game rather than just trying to build something totally new, right? So that's the reason I picked the word original, where you can actually layer on top of existing stuff and not necessarily invent. So here's an example, and I think this is a good example from the more recent times, right? So if you take Snake versus Block, it's a fantastic game, one of my personal favorites. It's inspired two separate, distribution companies, right? Hyper casual companies. Both of them are pretty reputed in their own right. If you take Voodoo went ahead and actually publicly claimed that Snake versus Block was the motivation for them to build Cube Surfers, right? And Cube Surfers, the gameplay of Cube Surfers is very, very different when you compare it to Snake versus Block, which is largely, a top-facing camera and going down on a bunch of numbers. With Cube Surfers, you get a sense that you're actually with the player, and the camera moves along with you, which gives you a more realistic gameplay. And close to first person, I wouldn't say 100% first person, but yeah, pretty close to first person. And the same thing with Gun Gang, right? One of Rolik's more recent games, you see that they have the whole concept of numbers baked in, and the gameplay mechanic is similar to Snake versus Block, but it's built in a very different way when you compare it to Snake versus Block itself. And all these three games have been successful. I mean, all these three games are chart toppers. So I think this is insightful for us to look at and learn from when we think of new ideas. So we have an idea, right? So we figured out how to actually come up with an idea. So what do we do next, right? The first thing, and probably the most important thing, is to choose a game mechanic, right? The game mechanic can, like I said, need not necessarily be completely new. It could be something that's proven. It could be something that's marketable. There's enough content on the internet today to help you actually find the top 13 mechanics in hyper casual, right? And if you spend a day, you'd probably get to know all of those mechanics. They're fairly simple, easy to use, and you get a sense of what's been working. And a great place to really understand what mechanics have been working is just the app stores themselves. And I do recommend switching countries and seeing, what kind of mechanics works in different countries. It gives you a perspective of, what the macro situation is in those countries and what type of audiences they are. I found it fascinating. The second step that you do is to build a prototype, right? A prototype is a fairly generic term. So I want to go a little bit more specific into what a prototype might look like, right? And what might it entail. So what should a prototype include, right? A prototype should include obviously gameplay. And I say gameplay in the sense that it should be super obvious what the gameplay is, right? If you show it to 10 people or to 20 people, there should not be a single person who doesn't get it. It should be that obvious. I think gratification is very critical, to say that there is no middling aspect in the game. What I mean by that is the win moments need to be clearly high and the loss moments need to be really low, right? We don't want to have middling gratification or emotions go through the game. So how do you build it, right? Become super critical in the prototype itself, because a lot of the success of your game will come from here. Uh, like we spoke earlier, focus on new or proven mechanics is super critical, because one thing you realize when you build games like these, especially for a mass market, is the marketability of these is as important as the game itself, right? Let me spend a moment to explain that. If you do not, if you're not able to attract the right audience with a low CPI, and we'll get to those CPIs later in a few moments, but if you're not able to build an audience around your idea and a path to that audience, it's quite likely even great ideas will fail, right? So it's super critical to establish a mechanic and a prototype that will tell you whether this base unit of the mechanic plus gameplay is marketable, right? There are easy ways for you to find it out as well. Is your core gameplay replayable, right? Like you can also check if players play it more than once. Are they coming back to play out your prototype, right? The last one, which is an interesting one, is there skill involved, right? What I mean by skill is not really from a hardcore gaming perspective, but if there is a skill in terms of timing, is there a skill in terms of dexterity, right? And what is interesting here is the lesser you have needs for dexterity and precision in the game, you automatically see that the audience for these games become wider. So it's important you make a call on what audience cohorts you want to go after. If you're going for a mass market game, it's important that you keep the dexterity requirements low. And imagine an 18-year-old and a 55-year-old, both of them playing the game, and both of them should be able to compete in the game, without any constraints of age or any other physical limitations, right? So this is important, and probably the biggest learning that I've had in the past few months, right? What should a prototype exclude? Right? It's a super critical question. And I think we should exclude audio or soundtracks, right? Not critical for you to ship or test a prototype. Ad integration, SDKs, none of that is critical, right? A lot of content. Your goal is not to really, bribe the user or give them a lot of content to like your game. What you're testing for is the core of my game likable, right? And you want to test it in the most cleanest way possible. highly detailed art or narrative is also something that you can invest in once you have, what in the non-gaming world we call a product market fit, right? Here, if you have a game idea fit to the audience, uh, it would really help you, then invest in these other areas. I think one of the things that do stand out also is user experience, and it's if you go towards making it functional versus making it precise and world class, right? It's probably not an investment worth at this point in time, right? I think having a functional prototype where the focus is on gameplay and mechanics is probably the right thing to do. Fine. I mean, we've gotten to a place where we've learned how to think of an idea, we've learned how to think of a prototype, we've got both of that. Then what do we do next, right? I think where we are at, in the gaming ecosystem is just the phenomenal ability to test and test and test and be able to test so deep and get relevant data for it, right? I mean, like a wise man once said, like you can't improve what you don't measure, and it's really important to pick what you want to measure, right? It's so easy to get confused when you have a lot of data with you. It's important that you lay out what you want to measure and then instrument it in your prototypes and then measure that. Right. The first thing is you want to test for interest, or as we call, heat in the game. Right. Player interest. This is so. A quick run through of how you could do it. Right. CTR, and for those folks who are not familiar, CTR are like click through rates in ads. CTR tests are the best ways today, simplest rather, to test for interest. You could arrive at a baseline based on your like 10 prototypes you have. You could arrive at a quick baseline and see which one of them does well. You will also have baselines by genre, game type, region, audience cohorts, and so on. But without getting into too much specifics, CTR tests, and especially on Facebook, is the best way to get started. We recommend you go broad based with audience, right? Go 18 to 55 years, because if you're really building a mass market game, it should appeal to a very wide audience. India itself is a great market to test first. Like largely what we see in mass market games is geography is not that much of a determining role in the success of the game. Because you do, when you're addressing latent needs or things that are motivating from a behavior standpoint, the aspects of culture and so on become nuanced and maybe interesting to keep out initially and later make a call if you want to introduce them in the game. Have super low budgets like 1,000 rupees per day for 3 days, fixed prototype issues as you scale spend. The next part we move to is viability and retention, right? And here we look at building just 30 levels of 30 minutes of gameplay, right? Here we iterate and iterate, and this could last a few weeks to a few months till you reach three critical pieces, right? We want to reach a CPI of less than 50 cents. We want to reach a D1 retention of 40%. What does CPI mean? CPI is cost per app install. D1 is day one user retention rate, which means how many users came to you on day zero and what percentage of them came to you on the next day. Average first session play time greater than 8 minutes. Those are, I think, the basic rules. Sorry, let me just spend a moment again. Those are the three basic things that we want to make sure, right? These three basic rules that you cannot break, right? This will really be make or break for you if you cross these metrics. What I also recommend is if you cross one of these metrics, but all three of them, it means that there is merit in iterating and taking the game towards different paths. At the same time, if you do not reach any base levels here, it might be easy for you to kill it and move on to the next one. And the thumb rule for viability, and though this may seem too simplistic, but I've seen that it's probably the best one to look at from a unit economics model, is to have the revenue per install be greater than the cost per install, right? We do have, in the free to play world, we call, there's 10% of the audience working for the other 90% who are not paying, right? But the hyper casual model will work the best if you have each player being net positive for you, right? How do you get to that model? Like, I mean, you can build in models where you know that If it's an ad model, you know that if the user spends 2.5 minutes in the game, and we show an ad roughly every 45 seconds in the game, you know that with 3 to 4 ads, if the user gets past it, it becomes from a monetization view positive. And this is a very cut and dry approach. We do not, I mean, while we think about monetization, I think it's critical that you look at it from a game design view first, and not just layer in ads without while compromising for the experience, right? If you want to build a game that goes deeper and turns into a higher retention game, potentially a hybrid casual game, uh, that is something that becomes critical. While you look at monetization, design also becomes super critical, right? Uh, so that sounds like fun, but what should my team look like, right? It's an important question, because how you structure your team will define what success will look like. Um, my suggestion is, like, for a small startup, right? You go with teams of 3, and potentially even smaller if you have somebody with multiple skill sets, right? Like, if a game designer can also do art, then that's fantastic. If an artist can do a little bit of game design, or a game designer can write code, those are like very good skills to have, and you could even go lower than 3. But 3 is a good number, right? Where you have mutually exclusive roles and everybody knows what they need to contribute for success. The goal can be very simple, like ship a prototype every week, um, test it for 3 days, uh, then make a call if you want to go ahead or not. Over a period of time, you'll have 2 lines of work. You will have a line that will be shipping a concept pipeline, be building on things that are future looking. On the other side, you'll have a set which is iterating, improving existing ideas, and making a hard call when to actually throw them out. And as you do that, you figure that you want to templatize UI, you want to templatize levels as you go. Uh, and that kind of becomes a flywheel of sorts, right? Which loops back into the next concept you build. It actually helps you ship faster, helps you prototype faster, and then you're focused on the core gameplay without worrying on all the other externalities, right? So the last part, which is just like an interesting anecdote, just to end the session, is in the '60s there was this case of the Fischer Space Pen, right? Which kind of always tells me it's important to know what we're solving for. And for folks who haven't looked it up, it's a case where there is a popular myth and there is a real story, but I think to just keep it short for the session, it's basically a pen versus pencil and what would work at space. And eventually, the Fisher Space Pens are still available today, right? And it's still available for even folks like us on Earth. But it is, I mean, it's a good backstory to go back and see, where we get to understand what we're solving for first. Literally millions of dollars were spent on this problem. Without really understanding what needed to be solved at first. And in hindsight, these things are fascinating studies to look at. I just wanted to leave this anecdote while we close the session. We have about 5 minutes, so happy to take any questions you folks might have.
Hey, so we've got a few questions in the Q&A area.
Yep.
So the first one was, can a solo developer with innovative concept and engaging gameplay make it alone on the App Store, or should he partner with a publisher?
I mean, there are cases where solo developers have made it great by themselves. I think one of the great examples is the game Hellrider, right? If you haven't looked it up, you should look it. It's a fascinating example of how a single person has built out all of the aspects of it. Um, However, like partnering with a publisher reduces the risk and gives you a longer runway, right? So my suggestion is, depends on what your runway is, what your risk appetite is, and how long you're going to go. And the last aspect is also your skill set, right? Some of the things that a publisher will help you with is all the mundane stuff, right? Like add SDK integration, doing all the analytics, like helping with UA, helping with marketing. Those are skill sets that you may not have. I think you want to consider all of that before making a call on whether you want to go solo or with a publisher.
Awesome, thanks. The next question, actually, we'll go from the bottom. One of the questions is why starting with hyper casuals? I'm not sure if it means in general if you should start with hyper casuals, or if this talk, why was this talk specifically for hyper casuals? So I think it'll be an interesting take on that.
Yeah. So my sense there is, I think hyper casuals from just a learning point of view is probably the most systematic way to learn how to build a game, at least in my perspective. And it gives you a good perspective of how you can layer in different aspects of learning to building games. Now, you might not take all of these learnings and go and build a hyper casual game, right? But what you could instead do is to test a concept with this model, right? So this could be a learning model for you to go out and try out any new concept. Potentially, the retention tests and so on can differ if it's not a hyper casual game. But I've seen it as a good starting board to learn. And the reason I picked hyper casual for IGDC overall was I thought it's a good platform to share what we've learned from working with hyper casual so far.
Awesome, thanks. A quick one, this one. I think this should be really fast. Does Zynga welcome pitches for hyper casuals?
Well, interestingly, we acquired a company called Rollick, a pretty well-known hyper-casual company very recently. So I think you can still, and Rollick does work with studios, and they do have partners. I think Rollick would be the best way to pitch for a hyper-casual game.
Cool. I think the last question we have right now is if there are any good references to check what's worked in the past year, especially games, top ones. So there is, I mean, I think there's the question says that this functionality or this data is not provided, although Apple and Google do provide top charts. But I think generally they're looking for advice of finding good data to base your decisions on.
Yeah. I think three things there. The first one is look at the top trends like week on week. Like they just said, freely available on app stores by country. You do have like a Sensor Tower and App Annie, which are probably the best sources of data where you can get fairly detailed data on how each of these are performing. The third aspect is my personal favorites, right? And two games I think have done a really good job of execution. And you should look them up, not Indian games, but Johnny Trigger and Sandballs, right? I think these are two good games that have been very interesting and inspiring for me to look at how they've built, and very interesting takes on their concepts as well. I mean, they've inspired a whole new genre of games and a lot of games on their own, but this is something that you should look up: Johnny Trigger and Sandballs.
Cool, awesome. Thanks, Akshay. I think that's all the time we have right now. If you guys have any more questions, you can hang out in the lounge if you can get a hold of Akshay. Or we haven't announced it much, but we do have a Discord server. People can come and hang out later once most of the sessions are over, and then possibly interact with the speakers or generally like share knowledge and information. But thanks a lot, Akshay. It was quite an interesting session. For me specifically, since like we've been talking about this, like hyper casuals, I think there are a lot of divided opinions about the genre and quality, but like as a study material or like learning the different phases of development, it's I think fantastic, like a really good medium to get started. So thanks for the talk.
Hey, thanks, Tejas, and thanks for having me. It was fun for me as well. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, guys. So we'll be starting the next session pretty soon. For the production track, we have Kashyap in the different session. He's going to talk about how they won the PM's Atmanirbhar Challenge. So hope to see you guys there next. All right. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Thanks, Akshay.
Thanks. Bye.